back to another edition of Civil Discussion on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, March 15th. A snowy day here in southern Vermont. I hope you've all gotten your exercise in with the snow shovels or whatever else. This is the program where Don, Keelan, and I talk a little bit about civil discussion and how to have positive conversations when differences of opinion surface and hopefully before they escalate into intractable emotional differences. And we're very pleased today to be joined by a very special guest. Amanda Ripley is a New York Times best-selling author, Washington Post contributor, and a co-host of the Slate podcast, How To. She's also the co-founder of Good Conflict, a company that creates workshops and original content to help people get smarter about how they fight. Her most recent book is High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out, a book that was published in 2021 about how to break out of the vicious circle of conflict as individuals and whole communities. Amanda Ripley, welcome to GNAT-TV.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Great pleasure to have you with us today. I enjoyed your book enormously. It fit in very closely to what Don and I talk about here in our civil discussion program, which we launched last year, kind of in response to all the uncivil discussion we were seeing going on out there. But just to kind of get us started, I was thinking, in your book, you talk about good conflict as well as high conflict. And I wondered if you could explain the difference between the two.
Yeah, so high conflict, the phrase actually comes from family law, believe it or not. So in the 1980s, lawyers and judges noticed that about a quarter of American divorces were trapped in these sort of unending cycles of blame, hostility, and viciousness. And so they refer to those as high conflict divorces. But it turns out there are high conflict politics and high conflict workplaces and all kinds of high conflict. But the basic difference is high conflict is the kind of conflict that escalates to a point where it becomes an us versus them kind of feud, where we feel morally superior to the other side and increasingly sort of baffled and enraged by the other side or other person's behavior. And in high conflict, it becomes conflict for conflict's sake. So the original cause of the conflict sort of fades and it becomes like a perpetual motion machine. We know from the research into high conflict, which is sometimes called malignant conflict or intractable conflict, that this kind of conflict is really different than normal kinds of conflict. And it is really destructive. And in every high conflict I've seen, and I've now seen a lot all over the world, everybody suffers to different degrees. So it's a really diabolical kind of conflict. And that's, for me, was really helpful to understand that the problem isn't conflict, right? We need conflict to get smarter, to push each other, to be challenged. The problem is the kind of conflict, and high conflict in particular is really self-destructive over time.
I have a question that I noted in the book. How simple or difficult might it be to be curious about the other side?
Well, in high conflict, it's extremely difficult, right? I mean, curiosity is the first casualty of high conflict. And when we feel threatened, it doesn't make evolutionary sense to be curious, right? So part of the challenge, I think, for all of us, but especially journalists and politicians and leaders, is to dial down the threat level, which has now been dialed way up by those same industries, so that we can be curious again, right? So that we can create the conditions for curiosity. And I could turn the question around. Maybe I will. What do you think? I mean, how do you find with your own show and your own conversations that you can create curiosity even when there's a lot of division?
Well, if I can follow up, we've had other speakers on, and one of the things they mentioned, I think, uniformly, was to be helpful in conflict resolution would be to find out, put yourself in the other person's position. What is it that's bothering them, as opposed to just standing still and looking at your own side, and looking at your own side, and that's it.
Yeah, right. And then, but to do that, you have to kind of know the other person, right? I mean, you have to listen to them, you have to ask different questions. I don't think, especially when we're very segregated across dividing lines, it's really hard to do that, right? Because we really don't know.
Oh, good.
I was wondering, how do you think high conflict begins? I know you address this a little bit in the book as well, but are there certain common starting points for some of this?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to figure out, is in following people who research high conflict, but also people who have been stuck in it, from activists to politicians to gang leaders to guerrilla warriors. What are the things? What are the tripwires that seem to reliably create high conflict? And there's about 4 of them that I could identify, but just to name a couple that are maybe the most powerful and least discussed, I would say humiliation and the presence of conflict entrepreneurs. Those are 2 things that you see in every high conflict I've ever seen, in every context, whether it's the war in Ukraine or a domestic violence dispute.
May I follow up on that? Your point and Andrew's. You mentioned in the book, one man's transparency is another man's humiliation. Could you help me with that?
I think you're talking about in Northern Ireland, when they were working on the peace treaty there, they wanted the IRA to disarm, obviously, and to trust that they were really disarming. They wanted photos of all of the weapons that were being destroyed. And this felt humiliating to some in the IRA, because it felt like, kind of just twisting the knife, right? Like it felt like just a way to make them feel small. Now, that may not have been the intention, but nevertheless, the humiliation was getting in the way. The intention was transparency, right? So this is the problem with humiliation, is that my definition of what's humiliating is different from yours. And that makes us really vulnerable to being manipulated. So conflict entrepreneurs, which are people who exploit conflict for their own ends, will often frame things as humiliating, whether they objectively are or not, because it is so likely to lead to this escalation.
Could that be one of the issues with the UN trying to get into Iran's nuclear works, get to see them? Iran is saying they are dismantling, but the UN wants to see it.
Right, and that's a perfect example, right, where it feels like a trap, because you need to see it because you don't have any trust, right? But seeing it might feel belittling or disrespectful or humiliating to the other side. So then that's where, really good negotiators get creative, and good leaders, about, is there a way to do this that doesn't feel humiliating? Sometimes, again, if you're really enthralled to high conflict and you're being led by people who are captured by high conflict, there is no way to do what needs to be done and be held accountable and not feel humiliated. So this concept of humiliation is, I think, really powerful and important.
I was wondering if, in the course of your research on the book, did you develop any theories or have a sense that high conflict today, in terms of the uncivil discussion that we sometimes witness nationally or perhaps even locally, is that a recent phenomenon, or is it qualitatively, or is it more or less the same than as compared to, let's say, 50 or 100 or even 200 years ago? And look back through American history, plenty of examples of high conflict, all the way back to probably the arrival of the Pilgrims in 1620. But I just wondered if you have the sense that, gosh, something has changed, something has shifted since, let's say, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
My sense is that we've always had high conflict. It's part of the human condition. What's changed, and I think there are some important things that have changed, right, is our ability to broadcast conflict entrepreneurs and humiliation at scale. So we can really escalate much more quickly. We can share fear and contempt and vulnerability in all kinds of ways very quickly in a way that we couldn't in the past. And also the pace of change makes us vulnerable to high conflict because it feels to people like things are out of control, like things are changing faster than any mammal is really evolved to handle. And it feels that there's no kind of certainty and no one's in charge. And in that situation, a country is really, really vulnerable to people who manipulate the conflict for their own ends. So I think yes and no. Some things have changed, including technology, but also our interdependence on other places. So we're now inundated with information about horrible things happening all over the world in a way that we weren't in the past. So that again amps up the threat level, real or perceived, doesn't really matter, unfortunately. And that threat level is what makes high conflict more likely.
Go ahead.
No, thank you. Is it also that more and more people are getting involved in discussing conflict? Today we have you, and really thank you for being here with us. But 2 weeks ago we had, I don't know if you know Russell Johnson. He's with the University of Chicago. He's with the Divinity School. He addresses quite a bit of the issue of polarization. And we had him on the show. The Wall Street Journal this weekend, they had David Isay, is it Isay? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask you about his organizations in a minute. But there's going to be more and more written about it, about the organizations that deal with it. But are we resolving it? And,
yeah, there's a funny duality, right? Like alternate universes that is happening where a small number of people have gotten much more engaged in politics as if it is a religion, right? And those people are getting louder and louder and louder. Meanwhile, everyone else is getting quieter. So we know that 2/3 of Americans have political opinions they're afraid to share. Almost as many say the same thing on college campuses. This is very dangerous, right? And counter to sort of American tradition of being less conformist and more having more freedom of speech. So you get this kind of pulling to extremes on the right and the left, and then a silencing in the center, and everybody else kind of flees the scene, right? Which yields the arena to the extremists. And this is very common to high conflict. It's not unusual in any way. It's what you would predict. Then, at the same time, as you mentioned, there are people and organizations working to study this behavior and to intervene, right, and to try to provide spaces and sort of actions that disrupt that spiral. So that is happening, I would say, more slowly than I would like, but it has increased significantly. I think it took the U.S. a little while for a lot of people to realize what was happening here. We often don't think of ourselves as a place where you get, widespread sectarian political violence, but we are not different. And so it is important that these institutions and this research gets done and gets done quickly.
One of the most interesting sections in your book, I thought, was the description of the group of liberal New York Jewish people going out to Michigan to visit with a group of conservative corrections officers out there, and then those corrections officers coming to New York City and seeing a different world. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit. How did you happen to come up or learn about that exchange, and what did you feel are the big takeaways from that? Because I find that chapter really spoke to me in terms of how, okay, when we just sit down and kind of meet each other in this, in the same place, you realize, well, these people that you thought you had nothing in common with, and it turns out you had a lot of things in common with, and your perceptions of them were completely off base.
Yeah, what happened was I was following people who had been stuck in high conflict and shifted into something we might call good conflict, so a healthier kind of conflict. And it became increasingly apparent in every case, across all different contexts, different countries, that the best antidote is not to try to get out of high conflict. It's to never get in high conflict. Like, it's just, once you're in high conflict, it's very sticky. It's hard to get out, not impossible. But by far, it's better to cultivate a culture of good conflict on purpose, right? So you're not avoiding the conflict, you're not pretending like it doesn't exist, because that definitely doesn't work, and you're not going to war, right? So you really have to cultivate the traditions and mindset and rituals that help us get through conflict in a way that is generative. So I was interviewing everyone I could find all around the world, who deal with conflict, and asking them, can you think of an institution or a group of people who have done this, who have really successfully created a culture of good conflict? And there's an organization called Resetting the Table that works on conflict in the Middle East and in the US. And Melissa Weintraub, who's a rabbi and also co-founder of that organization, recommended B'nai Jeshurun, which is this sort of mega synagogue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which had almost imploded in high conflict, as many synagogues and churches have in recent years. And she had worked with them, and she said, why don't you give Rabbi Roli a call? So I called him, and it was such a fascinating story because they had really had very difficult conflict about Israel and Israeli policy towards Palestinians. So this has happened in many places, but the basic gist is that the rabbis were to the left of some of the congregants, right? Some of the congregants felt that the rabbis' criticism of Israeli policy was a betrayal. And I'm condensing, but you get the idea. And it had spilled out into the open. It was in the front page of the New York Times, so all of which is humiliating, right? So now you're getting all those kind of precursor red flags that high conflict is coming. And they did, at first, the rabbis did what most of us do in this situation, was apologize and hope it would go away, which didn't work because it just kept flaring up in different ways. So to their credit, with the urging of a congregant, they decided to bring in Resetting the Table and actively rebuild their whole culture of how they deal with conflict, because they knew there was just going to be more conflict. And Rabbi Roli, to his credit, while he thought about leaving and going to a synagogue that was more aligned with his politics, he decided that he wanted conflict, like he wanted to be pushed, and he wanted to be able to push his congregation. That was, to him, essential to his job as a spiritual leader. So it took about a year. They had a lot of hard conversations. They would have difficult conversations in people's homes about Israel, and they would talk about their own upbringings, and they didn't agree, right? But what they learned is that a lot of their assumptions about each other had been off, like you said. So then when the next conflict came around, in this case, interfaith marriage, they knew what to do. They just did the same thing, right? They had those traditions in place, and they got through it without getting weaker. They ended up stronger on the other side. So then when Trump was elected president and most of the members of that congregation had not voted for Trump, they felt the same kind of sense of fear and anger and frustration, but also wanting to get into good conflict about this, just as they had over other conflicts. But they didn't feel like they knew enough people who had voted for Trump or would admit that they had in order to do that. So then, coincidentally, Simon Greer, who had worked in the synagogue, with the synagogue, and also with a group of conservative Michigan corrections officers, most of whom had not really met Jewish people, most of whom were Christian, he offered a sort of odd cultural exchange program where he would bring, a dozen of the synagogue members to rural Michigan to meet these Michigan corrections officers and have difficult conversations, just like they did in New York City, and then vice versa. And they would stay in the homes of the corrections officers for 3 days, and then a few months later, the corrections officers would come, the conservatives would come to New York City and stay in the apartments of the New Yorkers. So anyway, I happened to call Rabbi Roli about 3 weeks before this whole thing went down, and so I said, can I come? And he said yes, which was incredible good fortune and courage on his part to allow a reporter to come along. And it was unlike anything I'd ever seen, the way that these groups of strangers who were really quite kind of dreading this whole encounter. Like, they weren't excited about it. They had very mixed feelings. And the way that they very quickly were able to recognize their own mistakes, get curious about each other, to your earlier question, disagree like profoundly on important things, and then not all of a sudden on other things. So they formed a pretty intense bond across many, many divides. And then I also was able to go along when the Michigan folks came to New York City. And it was the kind of thing where, they all said, once you feel this ability to be surprised in conflict, you want more of it. So there's something a little bit almost addictive, or certainly euphoric about it. But very few people get to experience that in that way today.
Were you part of the visits?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
Was there anything that did not go the way you'd like to have seen it go, or in other words, were there any setbacks there?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the whole thing is an imperfect, it's kind of messy, right? I mean, I think for me, I didn't really have an outcome in mind. I was just trying to observe. But I will say, it was hard to resist the whole, I found myself also wanting to ask questions. And traditionally reporters, as you know, try not to get super involved, but it was really magnetic, the conversation. And nothing went horribly awry. Nobody punched each other out, To the contrary, I think everyone was kind of surprised at the affection that people had for each other very quickly, despite still disagreeing about a lot of things and leading very different lives. But part of that is because we've been so manipulated. I mean, just as an example, the Michigan folks were mostly pretty nervous about coming to New York City, even after the New Yorkers had come and stayed in their homes. Some of them had never been to New York City before. They were frightened. They thought it would be dangerous. Now, these are people who work in prisons, remember. And so if you look at the actual statistics on homicide and violent crime in New York City compared to Lansing, Michigan, the closest city to where they were, there's no comparison. I mean, Lansing was much more dangerous statistically. And yet it felt really frightening. And it felt frightening for the New Yorkers to go to rural Michigan. So you have to ask yourself, how did this happen? How did we get so frightened of one another? And how did it seem so scary for these folks to make this trip? And that, I think, is kind of the part that really was deeply disturbing to me, is how we have come to be so frightened of each other.
So in the time we have left, a couple of minutes before we have to run, I know you said earlier that high conflict is very sticky and hard to break out of, but is there any, formula isn't the right word I'm looking for, but are there any kind of sort of ways that you would recommend to people when they find themselves stuck in a high conflict situation?
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole thing I was trying to figure out, is like, what all these people, the politician who got into high conflict and got out, and the gang leader got into high conflict and got out, all these people, what did they do first, second, and third? And there were definitely patterns. One thing is that they all began to recognize the conflict entrepreneurs in their midst. So sometimes these could be people on your social media feed, it could be people you listen to on cable news, it could be your sister-in-law, like it could be your lawyer, right? It's any number of folks who seem to really delight in the conflict, who seem to use the conflict for their own ends. And the first step was really recognizing this and then trying to put some distance between yourself and the conflict entrepreneurs, which is sometimes impossible, but often possible. In the case of Curtis Toller, who was a fairly high-ranking gang leader in Chicago, he ended up moving across town, so he literally could not easily be found by conflict entrepreneurs, which helped. For others, Gary Friedman, who was a politician, he ended up using a different advisor as his political advisor, who was less of a conflict entrepreneur. So there's different ways to do this, but that typically is the first step. And then a lot of the remaining steps have to do with rehumanizing your opponent and yourself, right? So that it's harder to categorize you one way or another, or to dismiss you, or certainly to dehumanize you.
I like to go back before we lose the time. Can you tell us a little bit about, do you interact at all with StoryCorps and One Small Step?
Yeah, I'm aware of StoryCorps and One Small Step, and I've talked to those folks before, and I'm familiar with Dave's work, and I think it's really very exciting. I think it's this is the thing we need to do as a country that we are not doing enough of, is tell stories about people who disagree and tell them in new ways. And this is what we do, by the way. The U.S. government funds this kind of work in conflict zones all over the world, but not here typically. So yeah, I'm really excited about that.
And I have just one more, and I don't want to lose it. You mentioned in the book, one man's transparency is another man's humiliation, and you mentioned that humiliation is the nuclear bomb of conflict. I love that the metaphor there. How do you avoid that?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Don. I mean, I don't know if she told this story on your show, but Becca Balint, who I know you all know and is now a member of Congress from Vermont, when she was in the State House, she had this experience where somebody on the other side of the aisle was not behaving in a way that made sense. Didn't seem like in their interest. And people were getting really frustrated on her side and wanted to just blow past it and ignore the problem. And she decided to ask the woman to lunch. And they had lunch. And it became clear to Becca, at least, that there was a sense of humiliation happening over something else that had happened weeks before. And Becca was able to address that so that it didn't feel like she had been wronged in such a way. And then they were able to do the deal, right? So there's an example of just trying to notice when people might be humiliated and respond to that, see if that's what's going on, whether they should be or not. I mean, Nelson Mandela has this great quote, which is, "There's no one more dangerous than one who's been humiliated, even if you humiliate him rightly." So that last part always makes me laugh. But I think that's key, is being aware of it and also trying not to do it, right? So for me, I no longer argue with people or try to, write a cold burn on Twitter. Like, I don't find that exciting anymore, and I don't find it useful. I find it counterproductive. So anytime there's an audience, I'm happy to engage. I'm happy to argue, especially if it's an argument in good faith, but I always DM the person or find a way to remove the audience so that we aren't performing and risking humiliation.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for today. I think we could talk for another half an hour around this fascinating subject, but Don, I think had a very interesting discussion today on our series, and I want to thank Amanda Ripley for making the time, for being with us today. Thank you very much.
Well, can I mention one thing?
Okay.
Congratulate you for the Christopher Award.
Oh, thank you.
Can you tell us quickly about that award?
Yeah, the Christopher Award is given each year to a number of different, books and sort of forms of art in order to recognize people who have tried to shine a light in the darkness, right? At a time when there's a lot of darkness. So I was delighted and honored to receive it. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you. And the book is High Conflict. You can find it at your local bookstore or wherever else you buy your books or get your podcasts, whatever. And thank you again, Ms. Ripley, for your time today. Really appreciate that. Thank you to our viewers for being with us and sharing part of your day with us today. Hope you found the program interesting. We'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care.